right, if we have an understanding of what exactly constitutes a conspiracy theory. So my aim over the next 25 minutes or so is to sketch out a model that can help do this. And I'm afraid it's going to be slightly, well, it's going to be slightly on the abstract side. There's not a huge amount of hard data in this, but hopefully it's something that then can be applied to empirical cases and refined accordingly. And I'll try and add a few examples as I go along. So what I want to look at, what I want to do, therefore, is look at conspiracy theories as a type of communicative genre, specifically. And in doing this, not only look at their employment as a form of political persuasion or propaganda, but also try to get at this issue of whether there's something in their discursive structure which differentiates legitimate and illegitimate reportings of events. So legitimate knowledge as opposed to illegitimate knowledge as it's reported. Is there something discursive that we can note as a way of defining, making a distinction between these two things? Okay, so I'm going to start with a couple of fairly straightforward definitions of what is traditionally understood as conspiracy theory, and how this relates to, these definitions relate to disinformation and, as I say, to political rhetoric. So firstly, this quote from Bergman offers a very general definition of conspiracy theories. Unproven stories told as truth. And I mean, it's so general that this could just as easily as apply to the term fake news or indeed disinformation. And it indicates a very obvious overlap between the two, this idea of purposefully misleading information that's of consequence to both, albeit in occasionally different ways for each of them. So one strategy defining a conspiracy theory is to contrast it with an actual conspiracy. And Young and Nathanson identify these four features of real conspiracies. Firstly, that they're coordinated. Secondly, that they have an illegal or sinister purpose. Third, they're orchestrated in some way. And fourth and finally, of course, that they're undertaken in secret. There's a secrecy about them. And then Fenster defines a conspiracy as an act, presumably an act based on these four different features, while a conspiracy theory then is seen as the perception of an act. So the distinction is between an actual action and how an action is the perception, how an action is perceived. I think we might want to go a bit further than this and say that a conspiracy theory, at least as the term is mostly used, is, I suppose it's a misguided perception of what's an imaginary act, for want of a better word. So it's delusional or deceptive belief about, well, ultimately an invented act or an act which has been reported with a lot of invention to it. But of course, there's a conundrum here, because the secretive nature of the act, which is one of the central aspects of what a conspiracy is, and thus what also a conspiracy theory involves, means that it's very hard to find evidence to back it up, because that evidence has been secreted, it's hidden, it's covert. And this introduces a number of interesting epistemological issues, many of which are exploited by conspiracy theorists themselves, as I'll come back to. But one way of resolving this, I'd say, I'm hoping to say, is that is to suggest that conspiracy theories have a particular logic to them, which isn't found in actual conspiracies, and that thus they can be identified from their discursive structure alone, basically. And it's for this purpose I'm taking this a genre approach. A couple of people have already suggested that conspiracy theories have something of a distinctive structure to them. So Osinski and Parent back in 2014 suggest that the structure of a conspiracy theory isn't that different from normal political discourse. It's just that everything becomes that much more exaggerated, stark, and immediate. So there's an extremism to the way that the events are presented, and indeed to the drama of it, I suppose. And then Bergman, again, he describes conspiracy theories as having their own separate rhetorical style and having what he calls a specific internal explanatory logic. So they don't just present a particular worldview, but they do so via a distinctive style of communication. But I've not so far come across anyone who has made much of a go at sort of defining precisely what that distinctive style of communication is, what the genre comprises. So this is the jumping off point for this this theorizing about them. Okay, so genre is a conceptual term. It's used both in literary and linguistic language studies. It's got a broadly similar meaning between the two, referring to the way that categories of text determined by a mixture of formal and functional criteria. Categories of text, different categories of text are seen as having what Halliday and Hassan call a particular structural formula. That's to say, they're comprised of patterns in their discourse. There are certain repeatable elements that define one genre from another. They're a dialogic form of communication. And ultimately, there are a set of expectations which influence both their use, the people participating in them, and their interpretation. And Mikhail Bakhtin famously said that all communication belongs to one genre or another. Everything, be it an interview, a job interview, a talk down the pub, going to see your doctor. This is all a speech genre. It all has these particular patterns, features, which help guide how people engaged in that genre act and understand meaning ultimately. So they're also a way of organizing our knowledge and our experience by means of discourse. And finally, another important point about them is that they can be seen as goal-directed because they're all shaped in part by communicative purposes. So there's always something people engaged in them are trying to do. The communication is facilitating a particular purpose. Okay, so in sum, we get this this short list of the features that comprise a genre, that they're goal-orientated, structured according to patterns, comprised often of repeatable elements. They create expectations, particularly contextually influenced expectations. So you orient yourself to what normally happens within a particular genre, going to see a doctor or whatever. They organize knowledge in a particular way, and all of this, importantly, is achieved via discourse, via communication of some description. Okay, so that's a very brief outline of the notion of a genre. Next question: how do these factors then apply to the category of the conspiracy theory? And what I want to argue here is that conspiracy theories can be analyzed according to all these elements, and that analyzing them in this way can help us understand how they work as a form of propaganda. So if we see conspiracy theory as a distinct genre of communication, something which is separate, different, has its own particular nature as a type of communication, we can distinguish the following elements. So they can conspiracy theories can always be always have a particular purpose or goal. They use a specific epistemology or which relates to a distinct outlook or worldview, driven by a particular notion of how the world is. They're structured, they have a distinct structure, which is usually located around a particular, an archetypal narrative. Narrative is a key area, a key issue for how they work. This is built on a specific structural logic. To an extent, they use their own distinct vocabulary or idiom, which is another thing that you can often define a genre by, a particular register, for want of a better word. They occur within certain socio-cultural contexts. They're communicated via the use of a particular set of resources, communicative resources, and all this ultimately creates a set of expectations amongst those participating in the communicative event. Okay, so that is, as I say, a little bit abstract and a bit generalized, but what I'm going to do is go through each of these in a little bit more detail now. And what one can do is, if you slightly rearrange the order of these, you can come up with this admittedly slightly forced mnemonic of context, outlook, narration, structure, purpose, idiom, resource, and expectations. And these are the elements which I'm suggesting that all conspiracy theories have in a particular formulation. They're often linked. One provides the basis for another. But by analysing them, by looking at what their particular nature, the particular nature of each of these is, we can get a sense of how what counts as a conspiracy theory, and also how it works as a type of communication. In this case, a type of propaganda linked to disinformation. Okay, so as I say, I'll go through these one by one in a slightly different order from the way I've laid them out, which I'll explain later. First, outlook, as I say, outlook or ideology or worldview. Conspiracy theories nearly always have a very specific underpinning value system, and this sets the parameters for several other elements in them. It's primarily anti-authoritarian and skeptical. These are the two sort of overarching values, themes, which influence, maybe even determine much of the rest of the features. So the interpretations they offer of events can be reduced usually to the idea that official accounts are purposely deceitful. They're motivated for a desire for control over the populace, and this worldview is encapsulated in an archetypal narrative, which I'll come back to. So, for example, a lot of the conspiracy theories around COVID and around masks are very much to do with an anti-tyranny narrative, anti-authoritarian narrative, which, as I say, slots in with this general overview, outlook, this general worldview. Secondly, purpose, as I said above, there's always a goal. They're always goal-oriented in some way, and basically, as per the worldview, their outlook, the goal is to provide an alternative explanation of events to those given by official reports. It's alternative news, alternative skeptical reports of how things are, which critique mainstream views. And yes, so this explanation then works as a critique of dominant institutions of power, and usually offers a simplistic and a populist account instead of a detailed analysis of the workings of power. And there's an important distinction that can be made here in terms of their goal orientation. between the political and the epistemic. So the first of these refers to the ways in which conspiracy theories are adopted as a form of persuasion or propaganda. And the aim, in this case, the political aim, is to promote a particular ideological position, and in doing so, enlist the engagement of supporters in advocating for this perspective. So, sort of most high-profile example of this recently is the Stop the Steal movement, which came out of last year's presidential election. So it had a very clear political purpose when used by those in power, which was to influence public opinion, and ultimately the aim was to reverse the results of the election, to the extent that you got into these slightly strange paradoxical situations where some people were calling for the election count to be stopped, others were calling for them to be continued. It didn't really matter. The idea was that the institutional power structures were taking part in some sort of fraud, and this sort of anti-establishment movement needed to intervene. But alongside the political function, there's also a more psychologically based aim, which relates to epistemic issues. So the function here is to provide a template for understanding and explaining the workings of power within society. So conspiracy theories offer a theoretical model by which events within the world, and particularly events which have some sort of complexity or sensational or controversial qualities, can be analysed to produce this sort of reason-based explanation, which is presented as the truth. We've discussed this earlier in the conference today. This offers a way of comprehending the world and shielding oneself from implications of living with randomness and uncertainty and so forth. So you've got these two functions, the epistemic and the political, and they're also, one of the things to note about them is they're different in respect to the nature of beliefs held by those who voice the conspiracy theories. So the epistemic aim is based on the fact that one assumes the conspiracy theorist believes what they're promoting. And this is why, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, they're often viewed as a form of delusional behavior practiced by marginalized individuals or communities. The political aim, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily rely on belief from the conspiracy theorists, and its use as a propaganda tool could stem from an entirely pragmatic standpoint, as much as a conviction-based one. So it's an open question, I think, to what extent Donald Trump, for instance, actually believed that the election had been stolen, or whether he was just using this as a strategy, as a political strategy. Okay, so next up, we've got narrative. And as I say, the key persuasive feature that conspiracy theories use is narrative. Basically, conspiracy theories are a form of storytelling. And so, for example, Prashada and Blomert argue that for any given incident analysed as an example of a particular conspiracy theory, the explanation that the theorists construct is scripted in terms of a master frame, i.e. it's a set narrative replete with plot, actors, effects, into which the details of this new incident can then be slotted. Another way of putting this is that any specific example of a conspiracy theory narrative conforms to a basic archetype. And the archetype mirrors the general value systems that I mentioned earlier. So it usually takes the form of a corrupt and malevolent elite manipulating public opinion by means of deception for the purposes of political power or self-gain. That's sort of the general, that's the general storyline that underpins nearly any conspiracy theory in one way or another. And there's a very Manichaean strain to this. So those fighting against the plot, i.e. the conspiracy theorists, position themselves as representatives of the dominated masses, and thus they're very much on the side of good versus evil. And so the whole thing then, being an archetype, trades in generalities rather than specifics, but it can be populated with local details to prevent event-specific narratives. So, for example, one aspect of the Stop the Steal movement focused on the idea that Hugo Chavez was supposedly behind the voting machines. One sort of figure of hatred from the sort of general cast list of right hate figures was pulled into this to create a plausible narrative, which, as I say, fits with the general one, with this general archetype. Okay, okay. So linked to narrative, conspiracy theories also adhere to a certain basic structural logic, and this basically underpins their use of narrative. And this has three key dynamics to it: causality, absolute causality, in fact, simplification, and then a sort of contrastive positioning. So the logic which governs this structure is that all events have a cause, which can ultimately be identified, and then all actions produce causes of some form or other. Or as Barkin puts it, nothing happens by accident, nothing is as it seems, and everything is connected. And one way to look at this is to see conspiracy theories working like in the same way that fictional narratives, conforming to this notion of the logic of Chekhov's gun, this idea that put forward by Anton Chekhov, that in the dramaturgy, the logic of a dramaturgy of a performance is that if there's a gun hanging on the wall in Act 1, it necessitates the audience will expect that it will go off and be of consequence by Act 3, and it's the same in conspiracy theories, or in the logic of conspiracy theories. Everything is seen as being significant, and it's significant because it has a causal, it plays a causal role. The other tendency in conspiracy theories in their structure is that they offer, I guess, an all-encompassing notion of how power works, and this invariably makes it a simplistic notion of how power works. Melly, for example, has argued that conspiracy theories substitute a simplistic and populist-inspired vision of the good versus evil narrative in place of a detailed analysis of power structures. And this is particularly apparent in the way that conspiracy theories ascribe responsibility for events to the agency of specific people or groups, rather than acknowledging the complexities that tend to lie behind the actual way that power is distributed and executed in society. So they invariably offer some sort of tidy and thus simplified narrative, which is the result of deliberate human machinations. Next up, idiom. So as I say, conspiracy theories have certain conventions for their use of language, and this happens both at the discourse level, especially in terms of narrative, as I've just mentioned, but also to an extent in terms of the lexical level. It's interesting to hear some earlier presenters talking about the way, especially their use of corpus linguistics, has focused on lexical patterns and particular lexical items. But my reading of this, the idiom aspect of it, is that it's often not necessarily a particular technical vocabulary, particular register, as you might see in other genres. But what is very noticeable is the use of a cluster of terms which are metonymic, or in some cases symbolic, of broader narratives and of ideological stances, which are closely aligned with conspiracy theory. So these will often be names, phrases, terms, which have been adopted by the community for as a sort of shorthand for a belief system. Just to take one example, again, it came up earlier in one of the presentations, simply the mention of George Soros within the context of talking about global power automatically references a particular notion of a conspiracy theory based around sort of a traditional anti-Semitic narrative about Jewish global domination. And again, so he cropped up in the Stop the Steal movement next to Chavez and so forth. This is a sort of lexical shorthand for related narratives, I suppose. Okay, how am I doing for time? Gosh, let me rush through these last ones. So if what I've talked about so far is sort of the text of conspiracy theories, next we've got the means and the environment of how they're communicated. And an important component for the production and interpretation of meaning in communicative genres is always the context in which they occur. The context influences the rules by which the interaction takes place and the expectations participants have for how the communicative event is organized. And in a lot of genres, context is relatively straightforward. So for example, if we take a job interview, there's a set number of participants, there's a set time and place, there's a formula for who gets to speak when and how. Same goes for something like a lecture. Conspiracy theories don't fit nearly as neatly into, or their context isn't nearly as neatly delineated as this. They're rarely tied to any particular temporal or spatial circumstance. They're not self-contained. Instead, they're communicated via a variety of different channels. For the most part, their telling is fragmentary, it's very communal. They're very rarely told as a single coherent event. And then this leads to the resources that are used to tell them. So this same dispersed character is true of the resources as well. They tend to be a dispersed genre, they're multi-authored over different texts and modes. They can be promoted and discussed in books, documentaries, social media, internet forums, demonstrations, speeches, t-shirts, bumper stickers, and so forth. And I think this is significant because, especially in terms of propaganda, because as the philosopher Jacques Ellul has said, one of the things that is fundamental to propaganda is that it's sort of it has an overwhelming quality. It acts as a sort of total propaganda. So the dispersed nature of it, that it comes from you at all sides. It's in all, it can be told in any forum and so forth. Of the conspiracy theory matches very nicely or very suitably with the way that propaganda itself often works. Okay, so finally, expectations. Well, the idea is that all these different aspects then of the genre combine together to create the expectations that those who are adherents of conspiracy theories have when encountering the genre. So the logic of a conspiracy theory built on these expectations is that there's an explanation for everything. Every observable detail or fact has a causal implication. The truth about this explanation will be hidden by the authorities for their own political purposes. This, combined with archetypal narrative, which underpins the specific examples of the conspiracy theory, the ideological beliefs about authority and legitimacy within society, provides a sort of loosely structured knowledge community which can be susceptible to certain forms of propaganda based on a similar configuration of the above factors. And I said at the beginning, the aim at some stage is to work this into a model, and just having a list of 7 different categories isn't quite a model. So the model is more something along these lines of the outlook, the worldview, influencing the tools and strategies which are actually then used to communicate it, which then creates the expectations. Okay, so finally, very briefly to conclude, how we can ask how these different elements are suited to the 2 main issues I was talking about: disinformation and propaganda. And as far as disinformation goes, I think what the aspects which relate very specifically, the aspects of a conspiracy theory as a genre, which make it a type of disinformation, are things such as this casual aspect of simplification. So there are simplistic answers given to complex issues, and this necessarily twists or spins or mutates the actual information, the knowledge. It simplifies it to an extent that that it distorts it, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. Secondly, this belief in absolute causality, by having to use a structure which sees everything as having a reason, this again creates a false narrative because it simplifies or makes prominent certain actors which aren't the case. And finally, something I didn't discuss so far is that they also tend to work back from the conclusion. One of the things about having a particular outlook is you start with, if you're giving an explanation of an event, you start with what the conclusion, basically. You start with the idea that it's to do with a corrupt elite or something, and then you work back by finding evidence to back this up. And again, obviously, this leads to disinformation. And then as far as propaganda goes, well, they're premised on an anti-authoritarian skepticism, which can be used to demonize particular groups. I mean, there's an interesting paradox in that often the people who are being demonized in a conspiracy theory are marginalized people, but they're being positioned as having global influence. So, you know, if an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory will demonize a marginalized group, a minority group within society, but by saying that they have an outsized influence on the way that the running of the country works or something. Again, this issue of working back from the conclusion fits in very well with propaganda. The reliance on narrative, and particularly this Manichaean narrative, again, another thing I haven't really talked about here is this engages on an emotional level, which is also something propaganda is particularly uses particularly effectively. And ultimately, just bringing it finally back to one of the things in the title of the seminar itself, they foster a particular type of community identity, which again works very well as a force for community behaviour. So, as I say, I mean, just to conclude, all these have the potential for being employed in political communication as a form of persuasion, I think. And as we've seen over the last few years, they can have what are really quite striking effects when they are. Okay, thanks very much. Sorry for going over slightly.
Great, thank you, Philip. Thanks for closing our presentations today.